I'd like to invite you on a journey. This journey begins in Berlin, and it's a journey that changed the way in which I looked at the world. I was there reporting on the Berlin Marathon. It was the first marathon that went from West to East Berlin. And for some strange reason, I'd agreed also to run it with a heavy tape recorder. You can maybe just see me here, underneath the middle archway, looking slightly desperate and exhausted. I'm already about 12,000th out of 25,000 runners. But I'm desperate because I'm looking for somebody to hand over the tape recorder, because this is just 2 miles in, and I want to pass it on to them because it belongs to the BBC, but they're not there. So I end up having to carrying this blooming thing the whole 26 miles. But it actually turned out to be quite an advantage because I was holding the mic like that, and whenever people see a mic, they thought they were on radio. So they clapped and cheered, and it sort of really cheered me up as I was sort of going through various pain barriers. But there was one moment where something went sort of down my spine, and it wasn't just perspiration. It was actually in this picture here, just crossing over what was called the death zone, or no man's land. Because a few months before, I would have been shot dead, like something like 136 other people were killed over 28 years during the time in which East and West were divided by the wall. And it made me pause, well, it didn't make me pause, it made me sort of think as I was running, what an extraordinary transformation that had gone on over the last few months. Now, you maybe spotted there were various flags, but there were some people, I was told afterwards, wearing badges. These badges, many people wore in the 1980s in East Germany. If you wore one of these, you could lose your flat, your job, your education. You could be thrown out of university because it was a sign of protest. It was a protest against the militarization of education. In other words, at schools and universities, people were being trained in East Germany how to be soldiers. And this was a way of saying, that is not our vision for the country. There's something very ironic, though, about this picture, because it's a quotation of a statue. This statue was given by the Soviet Union to the United Nations in the 1950s. Whilst it's the same sort of image, and it says, this time in English, not in German, swords into ploughshares, it's much more of, it's a vision of force, isn't it? This is not like Aragorn taking up the sort of broken sword and remaking it. This is not like Arthur pulling a sword out of the stone. This is someone taking a sword and literally beating it into a ploughshare. But it's an image of force. This was, remember, at the beginnings of the Cold War. So I use those two images as contrasts between two different visions of how you bring peace. You can perhaps see here, this is another statue that I saw in a museum in Moscow, which is almost like a dinosaur museum because there's lots of old statues of Stalin, of Lenin, of Brezhnev, all sorts of different, but there's this there as well. So just hold those two pictures in mind, those two visions of how you build peace and how arts, on the one hand, a sort of a tough statue that's hard to move, and the other, a small badge that is easy to sew onto your overall. And then, if I may invite you, come with me 10,000 kilometers south to Rwanda, to Kigali. And then, when you arrive there, come in a small, battered old taxi and go for about a 2-hour drive to a place called Natarama. It's quiet, it's kind of disarmingly beautiful. There are trees in the breeze, and there are 3 buildings there that have stayed in my mind. Try and work this one out. It's quite strange because it's actually a building with a cover over it. This was a place in 1994 that something like 5,000 women, children, men went for safety, for security, for sanctuary, because that's what they did before. But this time, there was no safety there. Almost all of them were killed. And it's a memorial. It's known by some people as a killing church because of what had gone on in there. When I went in, it took a while for my eyes to acclimatise. You can maybe just make out what these are. But what struck me was not what I saw, but what I smelt, which was the smell of rotting fabric. This church has been tidied up since what happened in 1994. For several years, many of the bodies were left out on the floor. But it's been tidied up in different ways. You can maybe just see here, you can make out that the number of skulls that have been put together. And I could show you some really horrible pictures, which I'm not going to show you. You can maybe make out here, though, a poster. It's a poster of John Paul II, the Pope who in 1990 visited Rwanda. And this picture, when I took it and thought about it further, in a way underlines some of the difficulties of trying to understand some of the reasons for what causes genocides. Some people point to religion as one of the prime factors, but it's of course much more complicated than that. Because not only did some people who were linked with the churches involved in the killing, other people were absolutely not and lost their lives trying to save and protect people. So there is, as some people say, an ambivalence of the sacred. Now, I had to return home early from this trip to Rwanda because my wife had a miscarriage, and the heartbreak and the loss and the disappointment of that, in a strange way, made me think differently about what I just experienced in Rwanda. And made me think differently. It was almost as if the distant suffering became closer because of our own story. Back in the church, just outside the church, there's a memorial wall. You can maybe make out there are names there of the victims. But actually the victims there, it reminded me a bit of, I don't know if you've seen it in Washington, of the Vietnam Memorial of name after name. But can you notice there are blanks. Or there certainly were when I saw it, then there were blanks. And one of the reasons for that, as someone said to me, was that because it wasn't just one person in a family, but whole families that were erased during the genocide, because something like 800,000 people were killed in 100 days. The guide who showed us round, understandably, didn't smile much. I asked her, I said, well, what can I do as an academic? She paused, she thought, and she said, tell people so it never happens again. Never again. And those words have stayed with me ever since. And in fact, the visit, in some ways, I think, has changed how I've thought about my role as an academic. I spent a lot of time looking at religion and violence and the relationship between the two. But then I started thinking of the importance of actually seeing how the relationship between religion and building peace. One of the responses to what happened has been artistic. This is a piece of art by Paul Hobbs. Sometimes it's called Fear Action. And it's not a sword into a ploughshare. It's actually almost more like a ploughshare being encased, because machetes were used in farming implements, but they were also used during the genocide. You can see in emergency break glass. And he said that the reason he created this piece of art because it was to ask questions about the role of fear in driving people towards violence. He displayed this in London, and a man in his middle ages was furious with him. He said, how dare you put this piece of art up? How dare you? Now, Paul is a very thoughtful artist and invited the guy to sit down and have a chat. And it turned out he'd been a soldier in a peacekeeping situation, not in Rwanda, but in another place, where he had to clear up after the effects of an attack with a machete. And this piece of art had been like a catalyst to his memory that he hadn't really spoken about before. So there was a sense in which it opened up a new way of looking at history, and actually he began to see maybe perhaps the value of this art. But I don't want to leave, before we move on for Rwanda, I don't want to leave that as the final image. A friend said, don't put this up, it's a cliche. But this is a photo I took. The reason I put it up was partly because of the warmth of the welcome I received in Rwanda, partly because of the energy of the young people here who met us in a number of situations, partly as a reminder that even like a few months ago, a number of school children created Arts for Peace around Rwanda and took an exhibition around the country. Partly also as a reminder that there's a burgeoning film industry called Hollywood in Rwanda. So in other words, the nation is not defined by a machete. There's one 21-year-old who said, like a number of people, and I'm going to paraphrase, but she said, we should not wallow in past pain and past agony. because we'll be trapped in the past and we'll not be able to move forwards to the future. Perhaps if I could invite you now to travel about 50 hours in a car from Kigali down to Maputo, the capital of Mozambique.
During years of war, Mozambique was flooded with guns from all over the world. The country is now at peace, and the guns are being cut up and made into art.
Que a árvore da vida é mesmo para dar esperança e dar mais vida.
This is the story of how weapons of war have been made into a symbol of peace.
After a civil war of 15 years or so, which claimed about 1 million lives, after the peace treaties, one of the difficulties was this. There were something like 7 million weapons still left. Many people kept them. They hid them under the ground or perhaps in the attic. And one man thought this is not a good way of building a peaceful future. He was a bishop in the Anglican Church, and he couldn't go to sleep at a peace conference because he thought of these weapons. He thought they were like a snake being kept in the bedroom that might come back and bite individuals and the nation. And those 3 words that I began earlier with, of swords into ploughshares, came to his mind. And so what he did was, with a number of other people, he set up, and you may well know this story because it's quite well known, but it bears repeating. He set up a thing called arms into tools. And what that meant was that you could bring a Kalashnikov and you would be given, what would you be given? You'd be given perhaps a hoe. You could bring a whole set of guns and you might get, as some people did, a tractor. Other people got roofing. Some people got a bicycle for the guns they gave. Children would bring bullets and they would be given pencils. But then the weapons, they weren't just thrown away, they were decommissioned and they were turned into pieces of art, such as the Tree of Life. Now, this Tree of Life was made of weapons that were all manufactured outside Mozambique, all imported for the proxy war, a bit like almost, some people say, what we might be sliding into in Ukraine at the moment. But a proxy war that became like an articulation of the Cold War. And so you can see this is almost like a physical memory of the Cold War. But now, this is in Maputo Peace Park, but it was actually moved back, taken back, and it's in, you perhaps have seen it, but it's in the British Museum, the Tree of Life. Or more famously, this, the Throne of Weapons. Neil Macgregor, the director of the British Museum, described this as one of the objects that he used to tell the history of the world through 100 objects. I think it was number 98. Have a look closely with me. Just look for a moment at the face. Can you make it out? The 2 eyes and the mouth. The curator of the African galleries in the British Museum said he thought that was somebody weeping, because this is a memorial of people being killed. But the artist, Kester, said, no. For him, it's somebody smiling, laughing, because they are now running free. And again, it's interesting to think about how this was one, if you like, if you imagine, like a stone dropping into a pool and pebbles going out. And there are lots of other examples of the way in which these 3 words have had an impact. For example, in Cambodia, this is by Sasha Constable, an artist who worked with local artists in Cambodia and brought together weapons from various conflicts and created this elephant. You can see it at SOAS in London. Or in Colombia, this. I was trying to get a version of this so I could give you a play, but knowing my musical abilities, it would be very unfortunate. But you can maybe see that this is, it's a gun guitar, really. I believe that Bob Geldof owns one, but we couldn't get him here today, so he got me instead. But he saw a bomb attack, this musician, and he saw soldiers afterwards holding guns like guitars, and he thought, well, I'm going to use that and create this new use for weapons, and then work with child soldiers, which is what he does, to show that you can use guns for different things. Or in San Francisco. This is a bike rack. I'll never look at the bike rack in the same way. It's made up of guns that have been melted and turned into a bike rack. I hope they've got rid of all the ammunition. I could also give examples from Mexico, where guns have been turned into spades, in Finland, where mines were turned into furniture. But it's this one that I was so happy to find last night. I've been looking for something like this for weeks. I just found it last night. Can you make it out? What is it? It's a mirror made of guns by Al Faro, based in San Francisco as well. Now, what's interesting for that, partly it's a mirror, partly because art can act like a mirror, because it asks questions of us, but also because it works like a frame. Have you noticed how often news can be framed around violence? Whether that's aeroplanes going into towers or executions in the Middle East, or so on. But actually, there's a way in which what we're doing here in TED Talks is looking sometimes outside the news frame, outside the dominant images. But the other thing to observe is that what you'll be seeing on this side of the room and what you'll be seeing on this side of the room will be different, because your position, where you are sitting, is different. So we come with different frames of reference to any piece of art. So you might be thinking, you are being totally idealistic and ridiculous, Jolyon, because how on earth is origami or this kind of stuff going to help in conflict situations? Well, I don't want to overclaim the use of arts for changing the way we look at the world. But I think it's very exciting to think of the ways in which it can offer new ways of imagining the end of conflicts. I began with a story about a race. I'd like to head towards a conclusion with another story about another race. I told it recently it was a top relay team. They were favourites and they were winning, looked like the gold medal. They were just doing the handover and they dropped the baton. And they lost. And the cameras tracked back to the other people in the relay team, and you could see the tears going down their faces. And they were asked, well, why do you cry out? It's a pretty sensible question, but, well, not just because we lost, but because the runners didn't realise they could pick up the baton and keep running. They were so far in advance, they could keep running. Now I found a very sort of positive, encouraging individual story. You know, you pick up the baton and you persevere. But you can think about that nationally as well, can't you? It'd be easy to say the wall meant the end of Berlin as one city. It was always divided. The machete means the end of Rwanda. Or the civil war means the end of Mozambique. But of course, in each of these stories, how the arts and how other things are rebuilding these situations is extraordinarily powerful and hopeful for tomorrow. I recently was with a mixed group of academics, students, other people from lots of different backgrounds, and I showed them about 24 different cartoons which were produced after the attacks in Paris. And almost all of them said this was their favourite cartoon. And I said, well, what is it about this cartoon that you are so drawn to? And they said, well, it isn't an image necessarily of complete sort of aggression or defiance. It does recognise there is heartbreak. There is pain. But it points to a new future where the arts can be used both to wrestle with dangerous, difficult memories, to pinpoint hopeful stories of the present, but also to point towards hopeful tomorrows for the future. Thank you very much.